Hey there, welcome to the Basics lecture on cell communication. Now that you've got a grasp on what's inside a cell, let's think about how cells interact with each other. Cells can talk to each other in 4 different ways. We'll talk about these first. When cells signal each other from a distance, there are 4 different types of receptors used, and we'll talk about those last. The first type of signaling is intracellular. Molecules are able to pass directly from the cytoplasm of one cell to the cytoplasm of the next using pores called gap junctions. Some types of nerve cell signals are sent this way, and the cells in an ovary can also send molecules into a developing egg. Mobile cells can also directly signal each other. In cell-cell recognition, a molecule on one cell binds to a molecule on the next cell, and the binding sites are often the glycoproteins or glycolipids that we saw in the lecture on plasma membranes. Several examples exist. A white blood cell will bind to a damaged cell in a blood vessel wall, or a sperm cell can bind to an egg cell. A third type of signaling is local, in that cells are near each other but not necessarily touching. Paracrine signaling is an example. A cell releases molecules, shown here, like growth factors. The target cells are nearby and are stimulated to grow and change when the growth factor binds to a receptor on them. Another example of local signaling is synaptic signaling, where an actively firing nerve cell carries the signal to the next nerve cell by sending a neurotransmitter across the gap and binding to the second cell. Our fourth type of cell signaling is used to influence cells that are far away in the body. Endocrine cells, like those in the pancreas or the thymus, release hormones into the blood. These travel throughout the body and bind to any target cell that has the appropriate receptors on its surface. So even though there are different types of cell signaling, you've hopefully seen that some similarities in terms of signaling molecules and receptors. Let's look at 3 general steps involved in cell signaling. First, the signal molecule binds to a receptor called the reception step. The signaling molecule is usually called a ligand. Second, the signal is modified and amplified. This happens inside the cell and often involves dozens and dozens of steps that allow the cell to be very flexible in how it responds. This process is called transduction. Lastly, the final result is a response by the cell. There can be any number of different responses. Some cells start dividing more, some turn on new genes, some send a signal down a plasma membrane, but in all cases, the external signal of the ligand causes a response inside the cell. So we've looked at 3 different types of signaling, and we've looked at the 3 steps involved in signaling. Lastly, we'll look at the receptor molecules themselves and see how they behave in the cell. 3 of these systems are in the plasma membrane, and 1 of them is inside the cell. G-protein coupled receptors are the most common type of membrane receptor. Many different cell signaling systems use them, each one with a slightly different receptor. The system consists of the receptor, the G-protein, and some sort of other enzyme protein in the membrane that will trigger the rest of the response. Use the excellent figure legends in Chapter 11 to write down the 4 steps of a G-protein receptor response in a cell. A kinase is an enzyme that transfers phosphate groups from one molecule, usually ATP, to another, like this receptor. There's a whole class of receptors that use a kinase to put phosphates on the tyrosine groups of the receptor, as you can see in this image. Once activated, the tyrosine kinase receptors usually come together in the membrane to form a dimer. And this triggers 10 or more pathways within the cell. This is different from G-protein coupled receptors, which trigger a more limited response. Remember the plasma membrane forum, where we talked about the cancer drug glycopholone adding a cholesterol to a membrane to slow the action of a receptor? That receptor was this tyrosine kinase type. Use the figure in your book to write out in your own words how this sort of receptor functions in the cell. A ligand-gated ion channel sits closed in the plasma membrane until it's opened by the ligand. When open, ions can cross the membrane using facilitated diffusion. An example of this sort of cell signaling is a neurotransmitter triggering an action potential in a nerve cell. Use the figure in Chapter 11 to translate these steps into your own words. Our last class of receptors doesn't sit in the plasma membrane, but is down in the cytoplasm, or the nucleus of the cell. A ligand that is small and nonpolar can diffuse through the cell membrane and bind to the receptor. These receptors act as transcription factors, which are molecules that can turn on transcription of a gene. Use your book's figure legend to make notes on this last class of receptors. This completes our basics video on cell communication, and thank you for watching.